2 Corinthians chapter 3 is often used to say the Ten Commandments were done away. People hear the letter killeth, written and engraven in stones, and that which is done away, and the conclusion is made before Paul finishes speaking. So we are going through the whole chapter, verse by verse, and we are going to let Paul explain Paul. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 1. Do we begin again to commend ourselves? Or need we, as some others, epistles of commendation to you, or letters of commendation from you? Paul starts with letters of recommendation. He is basically asking, do I need another man to write a good letter about me to prove that my ministry is legitimate? That is where his illustration begins, with a written letter. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 2. Ye are our epistle written in our hearts, known and read of all men. Paul says, I do not need another man to write that letter about me. You are my proof. The Corinthians themselves were living evidence of what had happened through Paul's ministry. People could look at them and see the result. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 3. For as much as ye are manifestly declared to be the epistle of Christ ministered by us, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not in tables of stone, but in fleshy tables of the heart. Now, Paul says, you are not just my letter, you are the epistle of Messiah. This letter was not written with ink. It was written by the Spirit of the living Alua. And instead of being written in tables of stone, this work is taking place in fleshy tables of the heart. So before Paul ever says the letter killeth, he has already placed stone, spirit, and the heart in front of us. He has not called what was written on stone evil. He is showing us that the Spirit is doing a work inside living people. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 4. In such trust have we through Christ to Godward. Paul has confidence in this work, but he is not taking the credit for it. His confidence is through Yahusha and toward Yahuwah. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 5. Not that we are sufficient of ourselves to think anything as of ourselves, but our sufficiency is of God. Paul makes it plain. I cannot produce this kind of work by myself. My sufficiency comes from Yahuwah. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 6. Who also hath made us able ministers of the New Testament, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter killeth, but the Spirit giveth life. Yahuwah made Paul an able minister of the new covenant. And now we reach the statement people quote all the time. The letter killeth, but the Spirit giveth life. But Paul is still talking. He has introduced letter and spirit, death and life. So instead of stopping here and deciding what he means, we keep reading. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 7. But if the ministration of death, written and engraven in stones, was glorious, so that the children of Israel could not steadfastly behold the face of Moses for the glory of his countenance, which glory was to be done away. Now the 10 commandments are clearly in the discussion. Paul speaks of what was written and engraved in stones, but listen carefully to his wording. He does not say the 10 commandments are death. He says the ministration of death. Ministration means a ministry or service. And Paul says this ministration was glorious. Then he directs our attention to the face of Moses. Israel could not steadfastly behold the face of Moses because of the glory of his countenance. And Paul tells us exactly what was to be done away: the glory of his countenance. Which glory was to be done away? The glory of Moses' countenance, the glory shining on his face, was fading. That is the noun Paul gave us. So that is where we leave it. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 8. How shall not the ministration of the Spirit be rather glorious? Now, Paul places another ministration beside the first. The ministration of death had glory. The ministration of the Spirit is rather glorious. Paul is comparing ministry with ministry, and he is comparing them according to glory. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 9. For if the ministration of condemnation be glory, much more doth the ministration of righteousness exceed in glory. What Paul called the ministration of death, he now describes as the ministration of condemnation, and he says it had glory. Then he places beside it the ministration of righteousness, which exceeds in glory. So Paul is not comparing an evil ministry with a good ministry. Both are associated with glory. One simply exceeds the other in glory. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 10. For even that which was made glorious had no glory in this respect by reason of the glory that excelleth. Think of a 70-watt light bulb and a 100-watt light bulb. Both give light. Neither one is darkness. But when the brighter light is beside the lesser light, the greater light outshines it. That is Paul's point. The first glory was real, but the glory that exceeds it is greater. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 11. For if that which is done away was glorious, much more that which remaineth is glorious. Now Paul says that which is done away was glorious, and that which remains is glorious. So what has Paul already specifically identified as being done away? In verse 7, he told us the glory of his countenance, which glory was to be done away. The glory on Moses' face was fading. We do not need to insert another noun into Paul's sentence. We stay with what he already named. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 12. Seeing then that we have such hope, we use great plainness of speech. Because of this hope, Paul says he speaks plainly and openly. And that leads directly back to Moses, whose face was covered. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 13. And not as Moses, which put a veil over his face, that the children of Israel could not steadfastly look to the end of that which is abolished. Paul brings us right back to Moses' face. Moses put a veil over his face so Israel could not steadfastly look to the end of what was fading. And what had Paul already identified as fading? The glory of Moses' countenance. So the picture remains simple. Moses' face was shining, the glory on his face was fading, and the veil covered his face so Israel could not steadfastly look to the end of that fading glory. Paul does not say they could not look to the end of the 10 commandments. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 14. But their minds were blinded, for until this day remaineth the same veil untaken away in the reading of the Old Testament, which veil is done away in Christ. Now Paul takes that physical veil from Moses' face and shows us something deeper. Their minds were blinded. When the Old Testament is read, that same veil remains untaken away. Paul does not say the Old Testament is the veil. Then Paul tells us plainly what is done away in Christ, the veil. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 15. But even unto this day, when Moses is read, the veil is upon their heart. Now Paul tells us where that spiritual veil is, upon their heart. That takes us back to the heart Paul introduced near the beginning of the chapter. The problem is not Moses being read. The problem is the veiled heart. With a veiled heart, Moses can be read and still not be properly understood. The problem is not what is being read. The problem is the condition of the heart reading it. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 16. Nevertheless, when it shall turn to the Lord, the veil shall be taken away. When it turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. Paul has carried the picture from the veil over Moses' face to the veil upon the heart. Now that veil is removed. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 17. Now the Lord is that Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. Now Paul speaks of liberty. Look at the flow. Their minds were blinded. The veil was upon their heart. It turns to the Lord. The veil is taken away. Then Paul says, where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. He does not say there is liberty from the 10 Commandments. We do not add those words. We let the chapter keep moving. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 18. But we all, with open face, beholding as in a glass the glory of the Lord, are changed into the same image from glory to glory, even as by the Spirit of the Lord. Now Paul finishes the picture. Moses had a veiled face. Paul now says we all with open face. The veil is gone. And with open face, the believer beholds the glory of the Lord and is changed into the same image from glory to glory by the Spirit of the Lord. The chapter began with the Spirit working upon the heart, and it ends with the Spirit changing the person. So now we can put the chapter together plainly. The 10 Commandments are clearly in Paul's discussion because he speaks of what was written and engraved in stones. He calls one ministry the ministration of death and the ministration of condemnation, and he says it had glory. He calls the other the ministration of the Spirit and the ministration of righteousness, and he says it exceeds in glory. The ministries are being compared according to glory. But when Paul tells us what was fading, he is specific. The glory of Moses' countenance, the glory on his face. Moses covered that face with a veil. Paul then takes that physical veil and applies it to the mind and the heart. When it turns to the Lord, the veil is removed. That leaves us with a simple conclusion. Paul never identifies the 10 Commandments, the ministration of death, or the ministration of condemnation as the thing being done away. He explicitly identifies the glory of Moses' countenance as fading and the veil as done away in Christ. Then the chapter ends with an open face, beholding the glory of the Lord and being changed from glory to glory by the Spirit of the Lord. That is 2 Corinthians chapter 3 made plain.